Brazil has several unique characteristics whereby, 1/4 of GDP is in some way related to agriculture. Mining, the opportunity for mining is huge. When you look at energy transition and production line of EV batteries, EV cars, so I see huge opportunities there. Brazil is, in some regards, the world's breadbasket. That is not going to change. And when you drill into it, so much of it is actually productivity gains. It's not actually about cutting down trees and just planting soya. That happens, don't get me wrong, but the meaningful shift that's happened over the last 20 years is just productivity gains. It's been incredible. It's been immense.
Hello and welcome to Brazil is Not for Beginners. Today I have the infamous Tim Chamberlain, founding partner of Brunel Partners, on the podcast today. Tim, I'm really excited to have you on. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for the invite, Isaac. I should already correct you. I have to say co-founding partner, otherwise my co-founder might get upset. But actually, he's got pretty thick skin. I think we'll be okay.
That's why you're infamous. You take all the credit even when it's not yours. But I'm really excited to have you on, and we're going to talk a little bit about investing in Brazil. So for those of you who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'll cut straight to the chase by saying I think I'm infamous just for having the midlife crisis of opening a pub 4 years ago, which I think you'll touch on. I'm originally British, as you might be able to tell. I left England right after I graduated 98, left England 99. Between now and then, I've lived less than 2 years in the UK. I started out in Asia, which was really interesting and fortuitous. I did a shift in New York, which was fantastic, really interesting. And then I've been in Brazil for getting on 15 years now, which is frightening. I thought it would be another like 2 or 3 year stint. My wife and I thought that. And then it has its way of getting its claws into you and becoming home. And it's home now.
Yeah, it sucks you in. I think it's really interesting. My older brother lived in Shanghai for over 20 years, and he was one of the few people that stuck around that long. I think he thought he was also going to do a quick shift in Asia. And I think a lot of the expat communities, you see people kind of move every few years. One of the things I've felt about Brazil is it is a place that can be a bit more of a home than some of other expat places. It welcomes you in a different way, I think. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that. It's somebody that's been in a few different places, but can you tell us a little bit how you ended up in Brazil? So assume that it was finance that brought you to Asia and New York, and then also eventually to Brazil. Can I assume rugby was involved somehow as well?
You can assume if we take it back to the beginning, rugby was very involved. I wasn't a great rugby player by any stretch, but I moved to Hong Kong in 2000. And, I think we're very tribal people. We're looking for our tribe. And I found my tribe in the rugby club. And like the networking opportunities that were afforded to me through being able to play a bit of rugby was amazing. And it sort of, I already had a job when I got there. So it wasn't like I was completely flying blind, but you build a network through that. And then it was very serendipitous the way in which I got into finance. I was, I have slightly embarrassed to say what my degree is. I have
I'm excited.
undergraduate degree in geography, which I think is something you don't even offer in the States. I think it's not very common.
I think it means something different in the States than in Europe, if I'm correct.
Yeah, so it's kind of divided into physical and human. And physical is basically all about the earth and sort of touching on geology and cartography and things like that. And the human side is closer to anthropology, human behavior, civilizations, that kind of stuff. But it's very general. And my friends used to joke that basically I would only ever be able to get a job as a geography teacher once I graduated. But they felt that wasn't a particularly bad thing, as I was dressed like a geography teacher from a young age anyway. So it was kind of the joke going the rounds. But anyway, I did my year abroad. I did like 6 months backpacking around Southeast Asia, and then ended up in Australia and New Zealand doing the classic thing of working in bars and cleaning swimming pools and cutting lawns, all of that stuff. And when I went back to England, I wasn't feeling very confident in my future. And I was like, it was basically 2000. And I was like, right, if I stay here, I'm going to be couch surfing or basically living with 8 other friends, as I'd seen loads of other people do, particularly in the rugby community. They just like go out for beers. That's the main driving force. And it's just like work to live, which is good in some ways. But anyway, I just decided that I would take the first job that came along that had a proper, like very realistic chance of going overseas. And I actually got hired by a company called, in Europe, it's more famous for Euromoney. In the US, it's Institutional Investor, which is a finance publication. It's basically a monthly that is, it's not something you buy at the newsagents. It's something that you subscribe for. I don't even know how the business model is these days, but back then it was quite expensive and elite. Like the bankers were jockeying to be given awards by Institutional Investor for like best bank in Hong Kong or whatever. But I got hired to go to Hong Kong, and I had basically a great job of selling advertising in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So I would basically, I'm in my early 20s. I'm flying around all of these places. It was really interesting and lots of fun. And we had these,
Yeah, sounds like
I
it.
wasn't very good at selling advertising, but I was quite good at doing barter arrangements with five-star hotels. So you'd go to like the Four Seasons Hotel and say, right, give me 10 room nights. I'll give you this lovely 30 grand advertisement in the magazine. So it was good. But then from there, I joined a company that it was a startup that was basically involved in the alternative investment, the hedge fund world in Asia, which I genuinely knew nothing about. But it was like, I'm quite outgoing. I'd built a network, etc. So they taught me the ropes. And long story short, in 2004, the company's taking off because everyone is all of a sudden interested in Asia, and they asked me to go to New York and then open an office there. So basically, I'm sat in New York taking Asian hedge fund managers around to meet investors in the US. I did that for like 8 years.
That also sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, we did some good trips. We did some good trips, but the Brazil angle came about because head office in Singapore were like had the view that we should diversify. Let's not be just Asian funds. Let's be global emerging markets. And they're like, Tim's close to Latin America. He's right there in New York, so send him down. So I came down for the first time
New
in
York is right next to Brazil.
right next door, right next door. So I came down in 2006, and yeah, again, timing was quite lucky. Actually, it was the commodity super cycle. Lula hadn't scared everyone off. He was incredibly popular, and yeah, it was a good time. So having brought a couple of clients to the platform from here, we decided to start a dedicated business down here, and that's sort of the genesis.
And so came down for a short stint to open the office and stuck around.
I actually delayed. I was really enjoying New York, and I delayed coming down here, not because I didn't want to come, but just because I like it's nice. The head office in Singapore, they like to make a decision and see you act on it like 2 weeks later. Whereas, I'd just gotten married. My wife had a job in New York. So I was just like, let's just phase it out to happen in 2008, 2009. And then, of course, the financial crisis came along and everything got shelved. I'd been having the Portuguese lessons. I'd set up the company, and it was like, okay, well, I'm not coming with that company anymore. I'm coming on my own. So that was like a baptism of fire.
So you just jumped right into coming to Brazil. I love it.
I jumped right into coming to Brazil, but I did it in kind of a risk managed way. I didn't actually do the same job as I'd been doing because I was on excellent terms with the company in Singapore, and I just said to them, look, I need to do something else for a bit. So I got them to continue paying me, basically, to be their analyst in Latin America, and
Excellent.
still got my commissions, but everything had come out after the financial crisis. And it wasn't until 2014, 2015 that we set up Brunel and started repeating what we'd done for Asian funds. We now kind of do that for our clients who are Brazilian asset managers. We help connect them with investors around the world.
Excellent. That was my next question. So tell me a little bit about Brunel, how you started it, how you met your partner, and where the name comes from.
It is quite a bizarre story in terms of looking at the odds. So I grew up in a city called Bristol, which is in the southwest of England. I believe the population's about 750,000. So it's not too big, it's not too small. It's actually, I think it's in
Good size city.
yeah, it's biggest city in England to have never had a Premier League football team. So
That's not the best claim to fame.
it's not the best claim to fame. But yeah, I set up on my own, and I had two clients, and I was helping them raise money. And I was aware of this other guy, Daniel Rummery, who was also from Bristol and also doing the exact same thing I was doing. He had started his career in Switzerland, and back in the 2006, 2008 time when Brazil was taking off, the Swiss and the Europeans actually led the charge. They had these things called fund of funds, and they were piling into managers here. And Dan did very well with that, and that led him to sort of focus on Brazil as well. So he'd come down here, set up a couple of years ahead of me, and then we started cooperating on stuff like his raises. I'd help him out when he was organizing trips to the US and vice versa. But the name came about because we had this commonality in being from Bristol. And there's not, naming a company is always a challenge, but Brunel is basically a famous engineer who had designed ships. He designed the single gauge railway, or the standardized it. And he'd done this beautiful bridge in Bristol, which is across the River Severn there.
I love that actually.
Yeah, yeah. So when you Google, I literally remember doing this, Google famous people from Bristol, and he was right on top of the list. There are a few other ones. Banksy, the street artist, is from Bristol, but we can't prove it because no one knows officially who he is. And also, it's not such a great corporate name. So we went with Brunel.
Banksy Partners is not going to raise as much money as Brunel Partners, I don't think.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So there you go.
Awesome. And so tell me a little bit about, you said you raise money for institutional investors in Brazil, right? So can you explain that a little bit? To one, did I get that right? But two, can you explain a little bit more specifically what you do to people that are maybe less familiar with finance?
For sure. So we focus on what they call alternative investments. So these are not your mutual funds. These are not your ETFs, the exchange traded funds that you can buy and sell on your XP brokerage account or your Charles Schwab if you're in the US. These are more like private partnerships where it's not by invite only, but it's a privately structured fund, and you would get invited to enter basically. And you're depending on the type of fund you're looking at, they can be liquid where it's not such a long-term commitment, or it might be what they call a private equity fund where they're not buying listed stocks, they're buying literally private companies. A lot of venture funds are like this in the earlier stage where, you have no recourse to get your money back until the fund life is over. Sort of everyone gets in together at the same time. We put all the money into these select companies over three or 4 years, and then we spend the next 5 years what they call harvesting the fund, and you get your money back at the end. So we focus on these. They call them alternatives. So we have clients who do, infrastructure. We have clients who do venture. We have clients who do climate related stuff is quite topical these days. Restructuring is quite topical these days. You can't sustain interest rates at this level forever and not have any repercussions on the health of companies. So that's kind of what we focus on. And we focus on taking this small group of clients to institutional investors around the world. That was the initial focus of the business. Today, we have a couple of teams looking inside Brazil. So we have a team looking at pension funds here, and that's very different types of products that we would bring down to them.
Interesting. And so I guess just summarizing, if I'm correct, you're taking Brazilian investment opportunities to large institutions or high net worth individuals outside of Brazil that want an opportunity in Brazil.
Exactly.
Can you give me the pitch? So Brazil, why do I want to invest in Brazil? I think you said you got off back-to-back calls before this, so you should be nice and warmed up.
The world is always cyclical, and I would say that emerging markets in general and Brazil right now have never been more out of favor than and it's been building up for a while. So it's counterintuitive, but the peak years were under Lula, basically, of my experience working with Brazil. And if you look at 2014, when was Dilma's impeachment? Was 2015, I think. So we set up in 2014 to 2015. We had the impeachment. We've had Bolsonaro, and then we've had, all these fiscal concerns under Lula. So the pitch is complicated, but, Brazil has several unique characteristics whereby 1/4 of GDP is in some way related to agriculture. We have tons of, I should know this all off by heart, but I get my rankings mixed up. But like mining, the opportunity for mining is huge. When you look at energy transition and the production line of EV batteries, EV cars, China is controlling all of that. So the trend now is got to look for friendly jurisdictions. So I see huge opportunities there. I see huge opportunities related to carbon credits and general climate because that's a global thing whereby essentially a company polluting in Europe could offset that by doing great things related to reforestation, etc. Our friend Phil, perhaps,
Yes.
a Courageous Land.
Got to give Phil a shout out.
Yeah, they can offset that through opportunities in Brazil, and Brazil has definitely has its faults. We can cover a lot of them, but rule of law by standards of other countries is usually very predictable. Investors don't have a problem of assets being seized and that type of concern. So there are a lot of opportunities here. What we're running into now is that people are so excited about opportunities in the US and AI and et cetera, that it's kind of getting drowned out. So I would say our company, we're somewhere between a fundraising business and a PR agency and a marketing company. So we try and tell our clients, what conferences they need to be present at, what time of year they need to go. We should probably move into podcasting and get them booked onto the right podcast, et cetera, because it's
We've got one here for them. So don't be shy. Send them over this way. It's funny. A couple of the things that you mentioned there really, really resonate with me. I remember I had on a previous guest, Amanda Martins, who does market entry in Brazil. And one of her comments was Brazil should get a chief marketing officer as a country because people don't understand much about Brazil, right? So you mentioned kind of its size and the role of agriculture. I had on a guest a couple episodes ago from the Northeast. We looked at kind of what is unique about the Northeast of Brazil, right? Because Brazil is this massive country and has regional differences. And the growth of green energy, the growth of sustainable energy in what's a relatively
exactly.
conservative area, right? In the Northeast and Ceará and some of these other states, but the growth of wind power and solar power and green energy. And I think one of the things that I also see here, and obviously if you're investing from abroad, you have global concerns, you have global opportunities. You're always weighing yourself against different, rewards in different countries. So different kind of risk returns. You're looking at different opportunities. Obviously, the currency rate for those who are making dollars, it's cheap right now in Brazil. Although if you invested 6 months ago, you may not be so happy with how it is right now. But, I think that there's also an element of, you're in it for the long game. You can't time some of these things. But there's also an element of Brazil kind of exists to itself, right? It's so far away from everything. The economy is really local, right? So obviously you have these massive export industries, but you also have just really massive domestic markets for things, right? 220 million people and huge buying power and all these other things.
I can tell you a little story about this because we did a transaction a couple of years ago, and it was, I don't know if you've seen in the US this trend of funds, it's essentially yield funds buying the back catalogs of major musicians, Bob Dylan, Madonna.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, yeah. So that has happened in Brazil. Basically, Brazilian artists rely very, very heavily on live performances. And over COVID, that completely went away. It went away for a long time
Yeah.
here. Obviously, it varied by country, but it was a long time. Yeah. So a lot of them were motivated to recoup some of that by selling their rights, their artistic rights, or et cetera. There's various different streams related to it. But I realized through that process just how indigenous the Brazilian music scene was. It's like something like if you take any given week of Spotify across Brazil, it's like 95% of the music is locally produced. It's not like it's Justin Bieber. I'm probably aging myself. Who are the youngsters?
You'll still hear him on the radio, Taylor Swift. You'll hear
Yeah,
what
yeah,
is
yeah,
the
you will.
band One United? Is that the one now? Is that the one do your kids listen to One United?
Now United, you're aging yourself. That was like
Okay.
5 years
One
ago.
and
But
now they're
anyway,
basically the same.
but you're listening to that specific music station that there's like two or three of them where they play loads of Western music. But if you scroll through the other 90%, as you say, you get the occasional song, but not a lot.
No, but I mean, personally, I love Brazilian music. I have a big record collection of old Brazilian Tropicalia and like Black Rio music. Love.
Did you get into Southern Asia?
Not so much. That is more my wife's game than mine. I really love Faho. I think Faho is the coolest music there is. There was a band in New York when I lived there. You might even have been in New York at the same time. There was a band called Faho in the Dark. They used to play it in New Blue, and it was like a
Yeah.
really funky Faho. It was really, really cool. But I really love Brazilian music, and I have a cousin who does A&R in New York, and he came across Maria Senna, who's gotten kind of big recently here in Brazil, and he was like, "Find me a way, introduce me to her." He actually does A&R for like some pretty big artists, and was really interested in connecting with her. But Brazilian music, what's made it out is so small compared to what's here, right? So like, I kind of hate on Sergio Mendes because it's just like he's just playing Jorge Ben, not as well as Jorge Ben. But Brazilian music is great, and like you said, super domestic. And I think, like you said, it actually captures how big the local market is for a lot of different things. And the local stores, when you talk about the supermarkets, the convenience stores, just the different distributors, right? How big is Ambev in Brazil, right? Like the reach that they have. You owned a bar, which we'll get into, so I'm sure you dealt with these alcohol companies and their reach. But it's not an easy pitch these days
No,
that
it's
you're
not.
making for Brazil, but it's a big market.
No, and going back to that transaction, we actually ended up bringing in one of the big three global players to take a 50% stake in the local player. And they just couldn't believe the multiples that these revenue streams, essentially think of it as like a long-term bond. They're not buying new music. They're buying Georgie Benjor, all of these great names. And that, yeah, it's like half the multiple that the equivalent US peers are buying at. So it's,
Yeah.
and that's a good like illustration of what investors can find here. If they look hard enough and are open-minded, it's not even look hard enough, just be sort of open-minded. A lot of people, you'll just call up and say, "Hey, have you looked at Brazil recently?" And they're literally just not interested at all. So it's, it's a long game that we're playing here.
Yeah, obviously had the startup, as you know, and you get used to rejection. You call up a lot of people, and a lot of people, they don't just hang up the phone, but they hang up the phone nicely, right? They try to get you off as quick as possible.
Yeah, yeah.
When you see people coming with interest in Brazil, what's driving that usually?
We've had some really interesting investors come down in the last 6 months. Not many, but like a few really big ones. One was a $10 billion endowment from the US, and they spent a whole week it was like 4 days in Sao Paulo, one day in Rio. And basically, they'd invested here a bunch in the past, done okay. And he was just attracted to the fact that, I guess it's just classic contrarian thinking. Like no one is talking about this place. It never gets a mention. It's 210 million people. It's a large economy. There has to be something to invest in here. So I think that's generally it. We had another group from Seattle down like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was the same. They'd actually never been down before, but we're just like, they'd been long-term international investors, more in Asia and India, with just being open-minded and seeing there are good opportunities. The problem is there are a lot of, you talked about the currency has like decimated a lot of returns from certainly the longer term funds. So it's almost, I don't know, we're not working with any sort of classic private equity at the moment because it's almost like the macro is the most important thing there. If you get in at the right time and get out at the right time, there's luck in that. There's beta in that.
Yeah.
So it's we tend to look for more niche differentiated things.
Yeah, understood. One of my first guests was partner at Bain here that runs a private equity practice, and one of the things he kind of reiterated over and over was you can't try to time the market. You kind of just got to be a long term investor, and it's going to come out in the wash. That sometimes you're going to hit the cycle right, sometimes you're not, and you need to invest the right way, right? So you need to do what's best for the company. You need not trying to kind of time the currency for one thing or another because it's not going to work out that way. What was the impression, if I can ask, of the you mentioned the fund from Seattle, and so them as an example, what's like the impression that they get the first time they come to Brazil, first time they see Sao Paulo?
They were really cool because they wanted to walk everywhere, which is great. And they did because it was one of those weeks where the traffic was just absolutely horrific. And
Yeah, that happens sometimes.
yeah, they did a lot of walking, but it's refreshing because we also get the groups coming down who are wanting, I wouldn't quite go as far as a security detail, but it's like, even to go from one side of Faria Lima to the other, they want to take the bulletproof car and everything. I'd say it was refreshing to see that approach. I haven't actually had the debrief with them yet, but I would say in general, the food, the people that they loved it. The people, there's a vibe here which is really positive, which particularly, if you're coming from New York or even Seattle coming into winter, I don't know the city very well, but I imagine it's not as fun.
It's not hot.
Yeah, they had a good time. The other group really, really liked it here. We're really impressed. But then, you get home to your office and there's so much optimism around the US at the moment that it's almost like a relative trade. It's like this incremental $10 that I'm putting in Brazil is $10 I'm not putting in company X in Silicon Valley. So it's a challenge. I get it. But I do think, over time, it's been proven that, diversification adds value. I think, I saw a stat recently. It's like it's 6 of the last 11 decades. Yeah, I might be getting this wrong. It was in the FT yesterday that EM has outperformed, in the 2000s, emerging markets broadly way outperformed the US. But I think investors have a recency bias and the US has done much better for the last 15 years, which is great. But to me, that doesn't mean you should only do the US because we don't know what it's going to be like for the next 15 years, right? And a lot of it's in the price already.
Yeah, no, a lot of these things get priced in. People have expectations. You mentioned AI earlier. I think there's a couple of AI companies in Brazil that have raised money recently, right? Brazil's got a tech scene. I was working on some stuff about that earlier and having some conversations about how big the tech scene is in Brazil and how it's developed local solutions for local companies because Brazil has local problems, right? One of the episodes I want to do eventually on this is about fraud. You as a bar owner know a lot about that, I'm sure, and we'll get into that. But, Brazilian fraud is among the most aggressive and, the best fraud. So if you can reduce fraud in Brazil, there's a couple of like world-class companies that have gone on outside of Brazil to sell those types of solutions. But, you've mentioned some of these concerns around Brazil. And obviously, like you said, the wind is not in your sail at the moment in terms of pitching it. How do you try to mitigate some of those risks when you talk to people? What is it that you're telling them to encourage investment in Brazil or to get them over the decision point?
Yeah, I think because we're dealing with large institutions, the opportunity to sell, as you might have seen in The Wolf of Wall Street or something like that, where you get the person on the phone and you
Yeah, that doesn't really work yet.
doesn't exist. So we just try and give people the facts as much as we can and keep the ideas in front of them because it's a war for people's attention at the end of the day. And I empathize a lot with my clients when they don't get back to me quickly because they're just, AI is an example of the tools that you have to reach these people. You can find pretty much anyone's email these days. You're just getting bombarded. So we just try and be timely, be respectful, and emphasize the good points, like the good news, like a local institution X has committed to the fundraise. That's a good sign, a good signal, it gives people comfort. Whereas in the past, there were a bunch of funds who only raised money outside of Brazil, and the idea was that that's where the sophisticated capital was. But I think investors now feel more comfortable. They want to invest where the smart Brazilian investors are also putting capital. So that's a change I've seen.
Yeah, we saw that a lot in fundraising for my startup, where there was always a question of who's the local fund that's with you. And so, somebody that's not going to be on the ground wants to know that there's somebody there, somebody that understands the local market conditions and that's committed. That makes a lot of sense. So, kind of a two-part question here. What are some of the commonalities in the investors that you've seen succeed in Brazil? And what are some of the things that maybe some foreign investors miss out on or don't understand about Brazil? So I think those two are related, but can you talk a little bit about what are some of the common themes in people that succeed in Brazil and maybe people that either miss opportunities or don't succeed in Brazil?
I think I'm going to look at this more from an entrepreneur's standpoint because, for the last 15 years, if you're allocating to an investment fund in Brazil, there's definitely funds that have made money, but there's not money. Whereas the previous 10 years, you could have bought any fund and it would have given you a nice return. But in terms of the investors who I've seen do well, sort of, maybe cutting out the investment manager and just coming in, seeing an opportunity. We've got mutual friends who are building businesses here. I think they have an idea, they apply it, they tropicalize it well to Brazil. They're really persistent. They understand how big the market is and how, generally speaking, it's less competitive than it is, because you don't have the ecosystem has grown massively over the last 5 years. Don't get me wrong, but in fintech, it's very sophisticated here. And, arguably with picks, et cetera, it's ahead of most other countries. But it's the usual stuff of just persistence because it would be easy to find reasons not to do something because there's laws or regulations you're not used to, you don't understand, they don't make sense. I bought my house here, and that was not an easy process. Financing it for sure is not an easy process. You know, the trips to the cartorio, which is the notary publics, to get everything signed off, etc. You just need to be able to roll with that stuff and sort of accept it, because this is how they do business here. We're in their universe here, not ours. So you know, you adapt and you understand how it works. And if you find the right niche, the market is massive. So it's, you know, that's where your persistence comes in, being able to raise the capital when you need it, manage your finances, get the capital structure right. Those are the critical things.
No, that all makes sense. And I agree. I think the market is massive. I think the competition is lower, although the challenges are, there's still challenges. They're somewhat different. So I think you have less challenges from competition and more challenges. In a lot of situations, you may be creating a market, which is a little bit different, which is an opportunity in itself, but you've got to build that momentum and create that opportunity, which is a little bit different than maybe in the States where, you know, the first time you have an idea, you go look and there's 10 other companies already doing it. But I think that all makes sense. And I think the line about persistence that you mentioned is really something that's come across in a number of other conversations I've had here as well, is just kind of staying the path, right? Don't get scared away.
Exactly. And I forget how long you've been here. It's two shifts, isn't it? Of
Technically three.
okay,
So I
okay,
almost came down in 2008 when you first came down. I mean, that's when I first came to visit Brazil, was in 2006, but I came for a kind of an extended period in 2012 to learn Portuguese. And then I came back in 2013 and spent 2 years with Bain and moved back to the States, but spent a lot of time here while I was doing consulting. And I've been back for almost 4 years now, on this third time.
and if you look across your whole time here, doing business has become a lot easier. We don't go to the cartorio.
Near barely been.
Yeah, we don't go to banks anymore, or very rarely. Yeah, signing documents, etc. Goes back to the cartorio thing, but things are progressing and things are being disrupted. There's a long way to go, but it's on the right path in many aspects.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And it's one of the conversations I've had on here as well, is just what's it like starting a company now versus, you know, a number of years ago. And yeah, that the time at the Cartorio, I have spent a much less time there than I did on my first couple times. I haven't had to have my firma reconhecido in quite some time, which is always a pleasure because that's such a pain
Exactly.
in the ass. Just kind of wrapping up these questions on investing. Are there any sectors that you mentioned at the beginning a couple of them, but are there any sectors that you're really excited about where you see a lot of opportunities or where people are particularly interested at the moment in Brazil? And I say that not just like at the moment, but you know, what are you thinking about? If somebody listens to this in a year, are they still gonna, what are the sectors people are still hopefully going to be interested in?
No, I think you know, you look at the major global needs, you know, feeding an ever growing population, you know, it's going to hit 10 billion at some stage. You know, Brazil is in some regards the world's breadbasket. So that is not going to
Three
change.
harvests.
Yeah,
That was
exactly.
one of the things I learned. One of the only places in the world, three harvests.
And when you drill into it, so much of it is actually productivity gains. It's not actually about cutting down trees and just planting soya. That happens, don't get me wrong, but the meaningful shift that's happened over the last 20 years is just productivity gains. It's been incredible. It's been immense. That's always going to be there. It's not an easy segment to invest in directly. You know, there's restriction. There's a public company, SLC, that you can buy on the Bovespa, which has a great land bank and operates farms, but there's not tons of those companies. There's anything climate related, and that stretches from different approaches to what I really enjoy about my job is that you have to, you know, a theme comes up and you have to delve into it, but not, you know, probably you learn just enough to be dangerous and think you're smart, but not quite enough to actually go and pull the thing off yourself. But you know, we were looking a lot at carbon credits and the size.
Our friend Phil, Courageous
Yeah,
Land.
well, Phil is a good example. He's doing
Yeah.
projects that are 5,000 hectares, 6,000 hectares, etc. But the Amazon basin is, I'm probably get this wrong, but it's like 500,000 hectares. It's like enormous. And of which there's a lot of it, you know, that you can't actually buy, but there's something like 150 million hectares that theoretically are in private hands and you could buy and preserve. And so there, I've spoken with smart entrepreneurs who are looking to do that because, the Amazon is just the sheer scale of it is mind boggling, but that you can buy land for $150 a hectare. You'd never use it. It's remote, but you can use technology to track it and essentially overlay that with schemes in the local community to incentivize people towards preservation. And you could be running a portfolio of 300,000 hectares of preservation. So I want to see that done right. I haven't seen it yet. Uh, but that's something that's really interesting. And it's taken a blow because the carbon credits you get through that, there have been problems of fraud along the chain there. So they're the least valuable at the moment. So the most valuable are the ones where you're essentially a carbon sink. You're planting trees, creating biomass rather than preserving. So it's that's an area which I think will continue to be really interesting. I think we're about to start a fundraise for a fund manager. Well, I'm not going to name any of our clients, but it's they do turnarounds of companies essentially. So they're looking at situations where there's a great asset at the core, but maybe the company's gone into the. You see it with family businesses. The first generation get it right. Maybe the second generation make it better than the third generation. It's the Chinese proverb. They basically return the entire family to poverty. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but they might buy a completely nonsensical ancillary business, which drains all the cash flow from the company, and they end up in a financing situation. So our client there would essentially isolate the core asset, which is a wonderful ongoing business, restructure the company, use their fresh capital to sort of make changes, write down debt, or tidy up the balance sheet. And then they're left with a lovely stabilized asset from day one. It's not like private equity where you're, betting on growth for 6 years because we don't know what the macroeconomic window is going to be like. So I like these approaches where it's sort of tidying the house on the way in and then just stabilizing and looking to exit.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I have another investor who invested in Teddy, and I know one of the things that he's looking at a lot is search funds these days, which has not been big in Brazil, but I think has real opportunities. And it's come up before as well, this idea of family businesses and transitioning. And I think that's a real opportunity where people want to transition out of a family business. Maybe the next generation doesn't want to take it over, or the family wants to get some of the wealth and collect it. Or there's just good businesses that are, real opportunities are, we mentioned our friend Ruben, who was my first podcast guest as well, talked about this with some other investors he knows in other places where you're just buying a good business that's, run a little bit manually and bringing some basic professionalization and a little bit of technology and a little bit of know-how. And you can take something that, somebody built into a solid business through sweat and tears and, just why don't we follow up with clients? Inbound is great. If somebody's calling us, let's just make sure we return that call within 48 hours, and bringing some basic management to this. And it becomes a real opportunity for growth, right? Again, and not even looking kind of macroeconomically globally, but just within the country and seeing where there's
Exactly.
opportunities. But really cool.
The constraint is capital, right? So
Yeah.
probably that should be my pitch. You're helping me with my pitch here because the opportunities for that are going to be so much better now when interest rates are high, capital is scarce, banks are not lending like they used to, funds are not raising capital like they used to. So the opportunity set right now will be fantastic for a search fund or a private equity fund, etc. But the reality is, if you can get funded, you're in a great spot because if you wait until we've got the perfect president, everyone loves Brazil, there's going to be a wall of capital, and you'll end up chasing opportunities that you probably shouldn't be chasing.
Right. Well, if you can build now, right? I think that's also the idea is, kind of forged in fire or however you want to say it, right? The companies that can make through it now. So I think there's real opportunities if you can identify the right asset and the right business model and just grow with the market and wait for things to turn. And that's when you scale and you're ready for it, right? I think that's the idea. But I do want to get to, you lived every man's dream. You had your midlife crisis. You bought a bar, the Victoria. Tell us a little bit about that experience of going from somebody raising money for businesses that operate in Brazil to running a business in Brazil.
That was like you say, it had been a long pipe dream, but I'd say it was more than that because I think we're all humans and we have our anxiety is the wrong word, but one of the things that used to bug me was this feeling that, at the end of the day, if you strip through what I'm doing at Brunel, I'm essentially making a well off person richer. And I had this oh no, what's it all for moment, which I'm through now, clients. I love you all. I'm totally through it.
I had that moment too when I started my startup. I was a consultant and I was, making a credit card company half a
Yeah,
percentage
yeah, yeah.
more. Yeah, it doesn't, large numbers, small percentages. What
Exactly.
am I doing? Yeah, absolutely.
So I was like, right, I need to go and do something in the real economy. I'm tired of essentially passing pieces of paper over the desk from one side to the other. So I need to go and do a real economy business. Pubs, I had a really good friend who'd owned a pub here for a long time, the All Black, which was in Jardines. I think today it's what is it? It's a bar store in Jardines these days. I think it probably shut in 2018, something like that, but it had been there for 10 or 15 years. And there was another pub in Itaim, very close to Vacavea, which was called Camden House, and they shut as well. And I guess that there was some arrogance on my part that, hey, I know why they didn't work out. I know I can make it better. And we went in full of optimism. We did a decent job. You can attest you had some good nights there, but it's just
Yeah, I
a
did.
very, I really wanted to dip my toes in the real economy. And what I discovered is that the real economy is an absolute nightmare. You don't want to be there. So, employment laws, hiring people, suppliers, equipment failing. It was a really positive experience, but I don't miss it at all. We started
It was
in
a really positive experience once, right?
yeah, exactly, exactly. And my family were incredibly supportive, but my girls are getting older, and it's like, okay, I cannot be spending 3, 4 evenings a week and one day at the weekend at the pub because I enjoyed that part of it. I enjoyed the social interaction and playing host, etc. But maybe who knows? Like if you'd asked me a year ago, I would say never, never, never again. Now, who knows? Maybe one day, just a tiny bar. I don't want a big one ever again.
Yeah. The other thing you told me that I thought was really interesting was you said your menu was too varied.
Yeah. Yeah, you just need to be able to turn over your inventory. So if you have only one or two dishes that need radish or that's terrible, what a random vegetable to pick.
Yeah. But it was a random thing that you needed, right? You needed radish and then it would go bad and you were always buying
Yeah, yeah.
radish. Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's why hamburger places do so well. It's such a simple
Ground beef.
ground beef, bun, and then stuff with shelf life to go alongside it. And it's going to turn over. The salad you have there because everyone has the same salad. It's the same salad that's in the burger. We were way too complex, but it was fun and probably around about the same cost to me as doing an MBA. So it's a solid investment.
Yeah, you learned a lot. There's learning on
I
the
learned a lot.
the school of the streets, right? In Sao Paulo streets.
Yeah,
I love it.
exactly.
One thing as we kind of head to the end here, one thing that I don't know if I've told this to you, but I genuinely admire about you and have found really interesting is you and your family foster. So my best friend in the States does this. I think it's really amazing. But doing it in another country, in another culture, in another language is a whole nother level. And I just wanted to give you some space to talk about that, kind of what made you interested in that and what has that experience been like for you and your family?
Yeah. Again, this came about through, I guess, a verse. One thing I've learned is like, don't rule things out, give things a listen. So this came about in, I think it was 2015. We had friends here who were both working, but she was working for an NGO here, and she was like, "Oh my God, there's this amazing new stream of an NGO where they're fostering kids. Don't commit, but just go and listen to what they have to say." And we essentially went to an evening where they talked all about the plight of kids in the cities all
It's
over
terrible.
Brazil and how there was no formalized fostering in Sao Paulo at that time. It was happening. It was happening informally through church groups, through communities, etc. But it wasn't formal, which meant you didn't have the same rights. When we foster, we get a document signed by a judge, essentially saying that for this period of time, the kid is yours, it's your responsibility. But yeah, it actually came about that we were part of the first cohort of this NGO called Instituto Fazendo Historia. That just it's like telling stories. The NGO set up to basically track kids in orphanages so that they would have a book with them and giving their life story. And they expanded into the fostering. And by I think by about 2 hours, we were the first couple to foster officially in
Wow.
Sao Paulo. Our good friends who were in the same cohort as us, they had a kid, 2 days later, maybe. But we've just literally, it's quite fresh and it's quite raw because the eighth child literally left 3 days ago.
Oh,
And we
wow.
had that child for a shade under 2 years.
That's a long
So
run.
it's a big thing. And it's the thought process was really like, I'm not a massive planner. Life can pass you by really quickly. And some people, I really admire them, have everything in order and they'll do their charitable giving, they'll give back, they'll, whatever. I was always too disorganized to sort of do that. And when this opportunity came along, it was like, right, first off, my wife was emotionally involved and invested in the opportunity right from the beginning, and I knew she'd be amazing at it. But from my point of view, it's like, good. This is not like a fair weather thing. Once we sign up, we got to do it now. We're there, and you find out it's tough saying goodbye, but it's also immensely rewarding. Like the child who's recently been adopted. The parents have been waiting 5 years in the line for adoption, and you just see how much it means to them and everything. It's really powerful. And I think it's really good for my family, for my kids as well, to be involved, to help, etc. So yeah, everyone should find their way of giving back. It would be great if you can.
That's amazing. I didn't realize it had been 8 kids. I imagine it's not always
Yeah,
been such a long stay with one child. I understanding is usually it's quite short, right? It's a couple months.
exactly. I would say the median is 4 to 6 months. This is a big outlier. We'd had of the eight, I think there's been 1 year was the longest. 1 year more or less twice, and then it was like 3 months, 4 months. There's a legal process that goes on with social services, so it's essentially is dictated whether the original family is fighting or not, or whether they're just like passing them for adoption.
Yeah, that's a whole nother topic to get into with its all local complexities. But that's amazing, and I could hear in your voice how important it is to you, and how rewarding it must have been for you and your family to do this. And it sounds like something you'll continue doing going forward.
And yeah, I'm hoping we can have a break now because my daughters are they're at a pretty critical age as well. But you never know. My wife Jamie, she's a force of nature and she's incredible at this stuff. And if when she decides, we'll discuss, and then probably it'll happen again. But life is a long journey, so hopefully there's time to do at least a few more.
Yeah, that sounds great. And your small little pup in the future as well.
Yeah, exactly. We can have a little crash maybe out back.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I always like to end my episodes here asking my guests, what does the expression "Brazil is not for beginners" mean to you?
I think we've touched on a lot of the points, but yeah, it's just like it's definitely easier to lose money here than most. And I know the question itself is not necessarily about finance, but it's how expert are you? That's the phrase we would use in in Portuguese. But learning the cultural read of people, of norms and acceptable practices. So if you don't do that, you're in a completely foreign land. If you invest a bit of time, build up your competence, and don't take life too seriously, you can graduate from being a beginner fairly quickly. I'm still on the lookout. There are still times when I feel right back to being an outsider here. So it's yeah, you keep learning.
Every so often you get hit with those moments, and you remember that you're still an outsider, or just that you live in Brazil, right? I think that's it at the end of the game. There's always you got to keep your guard up, and if you let it down
Yeah,
too much, then something can catch you. I always, as a last question, always ask my guests if there's a Brazilian expression or
exactly.
a habit or something that really stands out to you. One of the ones I like is, our friend Brian used to say that saideira has a really strong meaning in Brazil, right? It's not like just, oh, one for the road. Like if somebody says saideira, everybody has to kind of, it's obligatory. You got to sit down and have one more. But there's other ones, right? So my wife, when she was pregnant, people would just come up to her and touch her belly because your belly belongs to the public, right? Your kids are part of the community. So is there anything that stands out to you in terms of an expression or a habit that's particularly Brazilian or that, yeah,
I wish I'd planned my expression. There's a bunch of them, but all of the ones that are popping in my head now are completely X-rated, and I'm not gonna denigrate your podcast by bringing them on. But my funny story, it's very similar to the touching of your wife's stomach. Early on, this is probably like 7 or 8 years ago, my wife had a business in Jardines. It was very close to Avenida Paulista, and where I live is quite close to a metro station. So I was like, right, I want my kids using the metro. So we'd go there on a weekend and we take the metro, and it's like it's normal for us, right? But it's not normal when you're in Brazil. You go everywhere by car. But we people are so much fun here. They're so friendly, so warm. But literally, I'm there with maybe a 4-year-old walking and a 2-year-old in a buggy, in a stroller. And this lady just comes in with all the love in the world and just starts literally feeding popcorn to my 2-year-old. And my 2-year-old's loving it and like throwing it into her mouth. And that was a moment when I was like, oh my God, if I was in New York, I would be going absolutely, A, it would probably never happen. And B, I would be going ballistic and people would be arresting the person. But it was sort of done with so much joy that I was like, okay, she's had 10 pieces, enough now, but thank you very much. It's that warmth that I think is one of the uniques. If you could bottle it and spread it around the world, it would be a marvelous thing. Is that personal space? I think yeah, maybe there's slightly less personal space, but it's cool. It's in a good way.
It's just a different conception of it. And I think there's something, again, our friend Brian is the one who kind of pointed it out to me, how much Brazilians just love kids. You go to a restaurant with kids and, I've got a 1-year-old and she'll toddle around to other tables and everybody plays with her and loves her. And if I was in New York, especially, they're not, sometimes they're
Oh my
reasonably nice
God.
restaurants, and, it would not be viewed the same way. People would kind of,
Yeah,
expect the kid to be held back. And here it's part of the ambiance. It's a little bit different. But
exactly. They're welcome.
Tim, thanks so much for coming on. This was really great. I really appreciate it. I had a lot of fun. How can people reach you if they want to learn more about how not to run a bar, or more specifically, if they want to engage with you to learn about investing in Brazil?
Awesome. I'm going to really age myself here by it's either going to be email or LinkedIn. So you can,
I was going to say, if you have a Hotmail account, that would age yourself. I have a couple friends that still have Yahoo accounts, even.
that's for the fantasy football there, right? So we are Brunel Partners is my company, Brunel-partners.com. And I'm just Tim at Brunel Partners. Otherwise, you'll find me on LinkedIn, I'm sure. And I promise to get back to people. Okay.
Excellent. Tim, thanks so much for coming on. This was great.
Thanks, Isaac. A lot of fun. See you soon.
Thanks again for joining us. This podcast was hosted by me, Isaac Matzner. It was produced and edited by Maria Filmis. You can find more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, as well as on our Substack page. We do love feedback, so please feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email at Brazil4beginners@gmail.com.